Hi, I'm Jackie from Adam Heart Cross Stitch, and this is episode 3 of my Learn to Cross Stitch video series. Throughout this series, I'll be walking you through your very first cross stitch project from start to finish. If you want to stitch along with me, you can download the pattern to create this little heart here completely for free from my website. On that same page, I've also included links to all of the supplies that we talk about throughout the series. But whether you stitch along with me or work on a different project of your own, everything we cover throughout these videos will get you through your very first project from start to finish. In this episode, we're going to continue working through our pattern, and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips and tricks. Picking right up where we had left off in the previous episode, we had just completed this first section of stitches. Now, when you're working off of a smaller pattern, like the one we're using, it can be pretty easy and straightforward to keep track of where you are in the pattern. But I've always found it really helpful to mark off my pattern as I go to help me keep track of exactly where I am and what I have left to stitch. If you're working with a hard copy pattern, so something that you physically purchased either in a store or had mailed to you, I always recommend that you make a working copy of your pattern, leaving the original intact. You can then use that working copy that you created to mark off your pattern as you go and make any notes that you might need. Now, taking the working copy that you made, or a printed copy if you had a PDF pattern, you can use a highlighter or a pencil to mark off those stitches that you've completed. Some patterns may include a color or a black and white copy of the pattern. Either one really works just fine. If I am using a black and white copy of the pattern, I prefer to use a highlighter to mark off the stitches that I've completed. If you make a mistake somewhere, there are erasable highlighters out there on the market, but in those situations, I tend to just take a pencil and I'll circle over the stitch that maybe I skipped or did incorrectly, and then once I fix that error, I'll go back and erase the pencil mark. On really large patterns, or sometimes those that are a little bit more complicated and just have a lot of different symbols, I also find it helpful sometimes to pre-highlight the symbol or section that I plan to work on. So this is what I kind of refer to as the 2 highlighter system. So I'll highlight all of the symbols that I plan to stitch in a single session. And once I've completed those stitches, I'll come back over with a second color, which for me is just a really nice visual tool to differentiate between the stitches that I'm working on at that moment compared to what I've already finished. And when I am working with a color copy of a pattern, I tend to use pencils. I find it really easy to just kind of circle or draw over the sections I've completed. And of course, you can always erase over anything that you maybe made a mistake on. And of course, if you prefer to keep things purely digital, you can absolutely do that. There are some apps out there that will read cross-stitch patterns for you and are definitely worth looking into, but you can also use any standard PDF reader to make edits to your PDF and mark off those stitches as you complete them. I like to do this by using a highlighter function and really just mimicking the same process I would do if I were working on a paper pattern. So with this first color completed on our pattern, let's go ahead and start a new one. Now there's really no right or wrong way to do this. You can jump around to different sections of the pattern and really pick up and start stitching wherever you like. If you are jumping around, just make sure that you double or even triple count to make sure that you're picking up your stitches in the correct spot. On smaller pieces like this, I tend to just kind of work one color at a time, moving my way down the pattern. Some folks like to start with the color that has the most amount of stitches and then work their way to the color with the smallest amount of stitches. And some people like to do the same thing, but in reverse. All that to say, you can really work your pattern however feels best to you. For me, I'm going to go ahead and just keep working my way down the pattern. So I will be moving on to this light green-blue color. So in the last episode, I showed you 2 different ways that you could start a cross-stitch thread. The first method was something we called catching the tail. And the second method was just running your needle under a few existing stitches to anchor your tail along the back of the work. Now I'm going to show you yet another option that you can use. And you may be wondering, why? Why do I need so many options for starting my cross-stitch thread? A lot of it's going to come down to personal preference, so I like to show you lots of different ways that you can do something so that you can decide which one you like the most. So the method I'm going to show you is really popular and for good reason. It's really easy to do and it's super nice and secure. That being said, it only works in certain scenarios. So what I'm going to show you is called a loop start. And this method only works when you're using an even number of strands. The reason for that is we're actually going to start with a single strand of floss that's double the length we need. And we're going to fold that single strand in half to give us the 2 strands that we're currently working with for this pattern. So I've got the color of embroidery floss that I'm going to be using right here. And just like normal, I'm going to go ahead and pull my strands from the number side of the floss. And what I showed you in the last episode was typically the recommended length of floss to use is from the tip of your finger a little bit past your elbow. But instead of cutting the floss here, I'm going to double that length. And I'm going to cut the 1 strand of floss that I need. And then separate that strand out from the rest of them. So now I have a single strand of floss that is double the length I need. So I'm going to take this fairly long single strand of floss that I have. I'm going to take my 2 cut ends and bring them together, matching them up. And then that's going to create a loop on the other end of my floss. And I don't want to snip this clean. I want to leave this loop intact. And now again, working with the cut ends of my floss, I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle. Leaving that loop on the end. Now coming back to my cross stitch, I'm going to bring my needle up just like I normally would if I were starting my first stitch. So for me, that's going to be bringing my needle up in that bottom left-hand corner of the square. Now I'm going to pull my needle through, but I don't want to pull through all the way. And now when I bring my needle back down to complete the first leg of my stitch, I'm going to flip to the back and I'm going to bring my needle through this loop that I've created. Pull tight, and that's it. Your loop start is done. It's really nice and secure. It's really easy to do. Again, you can only use it in instances where you have a single strand of floss that's double the length you need when you're stitching with an even number of strands. So now I'm going to go ahead and complete the next few rows of stitches. Continuing to work through the pattern, I'm going to go ahead and continue stitching with this next color. And while I'm working this section of the pattern, I want to talk through some of my tips and tricks for getting neater stitches. Post cross-stitch videos online, a really common theme throughout some of the comments that I get is all around the neatness of stitches. People tend to ask things like, how do I get the stitches to look so neat? Or they might want help troubleshooting, like why their stitches don't look neat or things they can do to improve the kind of look of it. First and foremost, I think the biggest thing is just time and practice. And I remember this so well working on my very first cross-stitch project. My mom is also an avid cross stitcher, and I've had things that she's completed hanging in my house forever and ever. And I can remember working on my first cross stitch project and knowing that I was doing everything right, but I just couldn't help but compare. I would go and look at her completed projects and just see how perfect the little X's looked. And I would look at mine and be like, why is it so different? So just like anything in life, comparisons are just not going to get you anywhere because people who have been doing this for years and years and years, their work is just going to look a little bit better, and that's fine. So I think the biggest takeaway is it just takes a little bit of time and practice. That being said, there are a few things you can do to help make your stitches look a little bit more neat. Now, I think 2 of the most important things are actually things we've already covered throughout this video series. One being the length of thread that you use. And again, I know it can be really tempting to cut a really super long piece of floss so that you don't need to start and end a strand of floss so frequently. It really will lead to through a lot more knots and tangles. You can definitely experiment and see like what kind of your sweet spot is for the starting length of floss. But if you are getting a lot of knots and tangles as you work, that could be one of the culprits. And I think the most important thing when it comes to neatness of stitches is the direction of your cross stitches. And this is what we covered in the last episode when I demoed how to create a cross stitch. And I said you can really start and end in any of the four corners of your square. But the most important thing is that that top leg of your stitch is always running in the same direction. That's going to make, I think, the biggest impact when it comes to how neat your work looks overall. Next most important thing, I would argue, is tension. And this is really where the time and practice aspect plays into the whole thing. I find tension something that's really hard to describe accurately or to show on video, but essentially whenever I'm bringing my needle down and then up from the fabric, I go until I just feel that pull. Now, if you pull too tight, like I'm going to demo right here, you're not only going to start kind of warping the squares of your fabric, but your stitches are overall going to start to look really, really skinny and kind of thin out the thickness and fullness to the stitches. But of course, if you leave your tension too loose, your floss is really not going to lay nicely. You're going to have some warping. Your stitches aren't necessarily going to be straight. You can see that there's just going to be a lot of extra slack in the floss, which is not going to leave like a nice and uniformed look. So you definitely don't want to have like any slack within the floss. You want things to be tight, but not too tight, which is really why this is hard to explain accurately, but one of those things that really does get easier once you have a little bit of time and experience under your belt. Something else you might notice quite a bit, and this is really noticeable when you're working with multiple strands, like 2 or 3, is that your strands of floss start to kind of wrap around each other. This is something that's completely normal and will happen to everyone. And the reason for this is every time we're pulling our needle in and out of the fabric, we're slightly rotating that needle with our fingers. That in turn is going to start twisting your threads over each other. Now there's a couple different things we can do to help combat this and just help your stitches lay a little bit flatter and neater. The first, and it's really simple and easy, if you just take your work in your hand and hold it up, and then just let your needle dangle. The weight of the needle will actually kind of pull down on that floss, and you might see it kind of twirl and unravel from itself a little bit, which is perfect. That's exactly what you want it to do. That really simple thing, again, will just kind of help separate those strands from each other, because it is very common that as you're handling that needle, you're just slightly turning it with every stitch that you make. Another really simple technique you can do to help separate those strands of floss so that the stitches lay nice and flat and even, and it's called railroading. This is a great technique to use when you're working with multiple strands of floss, and I'm going to start by bringing my needle up like normal, and then using my needle, you can see I'm separating those 2 strands of floss before bringing my needle back down through the hole to complete the first leg of my stitch like normal. So again, I'm going to bring my needle up and then drag it in between those 2 strands of floss to help separate them, which is really what's going to help you get a very clean look with not a lot of twisting happening with your floss. This can definitely feel really slow and awkward at first, but I promise it becomes so much easier and quicker with a little bit of practice once you kind of get the hang of it. And in this example here, I'm railroading both the bottom and the top half of the stitch. But what I actually tend to do myself more often than not is I'll typically only railroad the top half of the stitch. It just helps it go a little bit faster. And I find the end result to be pretty similar. So here on this last stitch, I'm going to just make the bottom leg of the stitch without railroading it, just doing it normal. And then I'm going to come up, and for that top half of the stitch, you can see I'm using my needle there to separate the strands and railroad that stitch. All right, and with finishing up that color, I've actually worked my way to the very bottom of the pattern, and I think we're very close to the halfway point with stitching this. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle and work on the black sections, which are the eyes and the mouth. As I start filling in this section of black stitches, you'll notice that these stitches aren't all consecutive. There's actually a lot of space in between the stitches. You'll find this in nearly every pattern you work on, and it will kind of bring up the question of just how far you should carry your threads. This is definitely a question I get asked about a lot, and I think a lot of this is really going to come down to personal preference at the end of the day. So in this scenario, if I were to continue working my way across, I would bring my stitch up here where that next black stitch occurs. For me, what I'll personally do instead is actually start to work my stitches in the way where I'm carrying my thread the least amount. And it's a little bit hard to explain, but you'll be able to see it visually as I just work across this section of stitches. And again, this is the way that I just personally like to stitch. You could definitely just carry your threads as far as you like. It will create a messier back. For some people, they like to have a neat back when they turn their work over. For other people, it doesn't matter. So it's really about finding, whatever balance makes you happiest. A few caveats and things to keep in mind as you're kind of figuring out what works best for you. The further that you carry your threads along the back, the more embroidery floss that you will end up wasting. Something else to keep in mind and watch out for, I tend to not carry my threads over any sections of fabric that will not eventually be covered by stitches. The reason for this is if you're carrying your threads over the back and it's just blank fabric, you may be able to see those threads peeking through the fabric at the end. They're definitely going to show more when you're working with a white fabric. If you are working with a black or darker colored fabric, it might not be as noticeable, but again, something to just keep in mind. So again, I'm not a fan of stating that there are any hard and fast rules when it comes to how far and when you should be skipping stitches to carry your threads over the back. I think ultimately you'll find everyone does this a little bit differently. Some folks carry their threads all across the back without even thinking twice about it, which is absolutely fine. Others might not even skip more than one stitch without ending their thread and restarting it in the new spot. So there's a lot of variability there. And again, I think it's about finding that balance that works best for you. For me personally, I tend to not carry my threads more than an inch. I just find that's kind of my sweet spot. And this is how I would stitch a small section like the black where there's a little bit of space in between the small sections. So looking to the back, you can see there's not a ton of thread waste or, threads being carried across the back. I try not to worry about carrying threads over the back too much, and that's kind of the happy medium I found. That's it for episode 3. Thank you so much for watching. In the next episode, we will finish stitching this little guy. A friendly reminder, if you're interested in stitching along with me, you can download the pattern to create this little heart for free on my website. Also linked to all of the supplies that we talk about throughout the video series on that same page. Thank you again for watching. I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch, and I'll see you next time.